is before you. One by one we will take you.
Hey, David.
Hey, Tim.
This is a top five.
A top five? Yay!
Yeah,
I missed them. Where have they
been? Actually, it's a top 10 because you do the top five science fiction movies. I do the top five horror movies.
We do.
Well, as people can already see by our cute little graphics behind us, we're going to take on 2013. 2013. Why, you say, are we going to 2013? Well, we wanted to do something a little bit modern this time, but we are going back 10 years.
It was a big year, though, for movies. There were a lot of really big movies.
Yes, there were. I have a list of them. 12 Years a Slave came out that year. American Hustle, Captain Phillips, Dallas Buyers Club, Saving Mr. Banks, Nebraska, The Wolf of Wall Street, and Frozen.
And I've kind of restricted my sci-fi top five because I've eliminated the superhero movies. So that year also had Thor: Dark World came out, Iron Man 3 came out, Man of Steel came out, and The Wolverine all came out in 2013. So huge superhero year as well.
Well, I can kind of understand you excluding those.
Do you want to dive in and see?
I think that we should. My number five is a little film called Mama. Mama was directed by Andy Muschietti, or Muschietti, if I'm saying that right, who was kind of in the peripheral at the time. He has gone on to do It and It Chapter 2, which, of course, you know, he exploded after that. But Mama was a little film that was produced by Guillermo del Toro. It stars Jessica Chastain, and it's basically about a couple that take in the man's niece and her sister after they've been lost in the wilderness for 5 years. So they're basically two feral children. What they don't know is that a supernatural spirit has latched on to them, and that is how they survived, by the way.
Oh, okay. Now I'm remembering the trailers for that.
I had never seen the movie, and as I said, I reviewed several of these movies before I made my choices, and this one, I think it's a solid number five.
My number five may shock you. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but a lot of people don't like this movie, and I actually did. It's Ender's Game. It's based on the novel by Orson Scott Card. It stars Harrison Ford. It's directed by Gavin Hood. I actually enjoyed this movie. I went into it when I first watched it because I'd seen so many reviews say how bad it was. And I thought, really? Okay, it's Orson Scott Card, so it might be good. I'll double check. And it actually is pretty good. It reminds me of a more dramatic version of The Last Starfighter. Do you remember that one from the 80s?
Yeah.
It's sort of like that. It's basically children are the best fighters in the galaxy. So children are harvested from all over the galaxy and taught in this regimented school, and they fight virtually. So they're essentially commanding drones and drone ships and all this.
I'm not a big Orson Scott Card fan for obvious reasons.
Obvious reasons, understood, yes.
So, I missed that one. But, okay, I'll take your word for it.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
My number four is a little film called Oculus. Oculus is directed by someone that we're very familiar with, and that is Mike Flanagan. Anyone that ever has watched us knows that we kind of worship at the altar of Mike Flanagan. This was an early offering of his, starring a superhero. Karen Gillian is in this movie. She played Nebula in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. This little movie is, like I said, it was an early one for Mike before he did Hill House on Netflix and then other Stephen King properties. This one's about a woman that's trying to exonerate her brother who was convicted of murdering their father, basically by proving that it was a supernatural phenomenon involving a mirror. I had seen this movie, but it had been a while, so I wanted to go back and rewatch it to solidify it as a selection. and having viewed, you know how we go back and rewatch Mike Flanagan and how we find things that make it even better. Well, it was the same way with this one. I was like, wow, this really is a good film. So Oculus is my number 4.
My number 4 is one that I bet you haven't seen and I bet you won't see. It's called Oblivion. Post-apocalyptic. So the Earth has been invaded and basically decimated and destroyed by an alien force. And you have one lone survivor played by Tom Cruise, who...
Whoa.
Hence you not watching it, but he has been tasked by the AI to extract all of Earth's remaining resources. So every day he leaves his little floating cubicle and goes down to the surface of the Earth, fights off evil alien drones, and tries to rescue Earth's resources. It's Mission Impossible in space. Tom Cruise's character starts questioning the AI that sends him daily on the tasks anyway. Is this really an Earth AI or is it an alien AI? And is he actually helping the aliens?
Beat them or burn them. They go up pretty easy.
My number 3 is another movie I had never seen. It is called We Are What We Are. It stars a guy named Bill Sage and Amber Childers, who I'm not really familiar with, but they were strong. And then in minor roles were Julia Garner and Wyatt Russell. 2 young up-and-comers, Wyatt Russell's Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn's son. Julia Garner has won 3 Emmys for the show Ozark. So I was like, this is going to be good. And I was not let down. Basically, it is about the Parkers, a reclusive family who follows some ancient customs, and how their way of life is disrupted from a torrential downpour that starts revealing some things and forcing the daughters to assume responsibilities that are a little bit beyond those of a typical family. And I will leave it there because I don't want to spoil anything for anybody who has not seen this movie. But the ending shocked me. It was disturbing.
We are what we are.
We are what we are. I have added it to our list of films to cover on the podcast.
I'm sure you have. Okay. My number 3 was hugely popular. I didn't do the research, but I'll bet it was in the top 5 movies of that year. It is the sequel and the continuing adventures of Katniss Everdeen and Peeta Mellark, Hunger Games Catching Fire, which was the sequel. The basic story is, yay, we thought we'd survive, but the evil capital has other plans, and now all of the survivors and all of the winners are going to compete in the Hunger Games as well. Have you seen any of the Hunger Games?
Just the first one, the one we covered on our podcast, remember?
And I don't have to watch the rest of them unless we cover it in the podcast, she says. No, I'm going to do it. Anyway, that's my number 3, Hunger Games. I thought it was great science fiction. And again, that different, totalitarian sort of story.
Why are you torturing me like this?
My number 2 is a reboot / remake. It's Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead. Brutal and violent and gory and dark and disturbing, very much like the original Evil Dead from 1981. However, it doesn't get very high ratings, and I was wondering why. And I think one of the reasons why is people like the humor of Evil Dead 2, and I don't. This movie goes back to the roots of the first film that is very dark. It stars Jane Levy and Lou Taylor Pucci. It's basically the same story. They did change up the ending a bit. Instead of having a final guy, they have a final girl, which I do disagree with. But overall, I like this movie. This was the second time I had seen it, and I was impressed with what they did with it.
My number 2 is a movie that I would bet money you have not seen, but I really, really, really strongly recommend you do. I think you would like this movie. It's really good science fiction, and it's extremely underrated. It's called Europa Report. I would posit, and I'm stating for the record that If it is not the best, it is one of the best found footage films I've ever seen.
Oh no.
And I think you'll like it as a great example of found footage because there is no shaky cam in it at all.
Okay.
It's about man's first planetary expedition to Europa. This is survival in deep space when you lose communication. So it's that, do we go on with the mission? If we do, it's still going to take us 2.5 years even to get back home. It is so well done, so underrated. I highly recommend it. Europa Report.
My number one
Dun, dun,
is,
dun.
and this should not be that surprising. It was probably one of the number one movies of that year. And it is a little film called The Conjuring. This one's directed by James Wan, stars Patrick Wilson, Vera Farmiga, Ron Livingston, and Lily Taylor. As you know, James Wan came on the scene with the movie Saw. He has since become not only a director, but a very strong producer. And this is one of the biggest franchised horrors, I think, out there because the Annabelles are spun off of it. The Nun is spun off of it. Well, forget all of those. Just go back to the original. The Conjuring is supposedly based on a true story. It does involve two people that are real, and those are Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were psychic investigators in the 1970s. Borderlines a ghost story / possession story. Mm-hmm. And there are great jump scares in it. The cast is solid, and I just think that out of all of the movies I've listed, it would definitely be my number one.
My number one, no surprise if you look at any list from that year and what are the science fiction movies of that year, a little film starring Sandra Bullock, George Clooney, Ed Harris, and directed by Alfonso Cuarón and written by him. It's called Gravity, an extremely good movie. We've actually done it on the podcast.
We have.
So I know you have seen it. Loved every minute of this movie, especially loved the first 12.5 minutes, which are one single freaking shot. And it is amazing. The practicality of the physics of everything and what they do to produce the realistic space or space effects. I thought it was great concentrating on a single individual and her survival. It's a survival movie. It's basically, if you get stranded in space, how do you get back to Earth and home? And what are your possibilities? I thought Sandra Bullock was just amazing in this movie. I think she was nominated actually for it, which is good.
I don't remember. I just know that the movie is terrifying. I could actually almost put it in a horror movie class because of the fact that it literally had me in its grip for the entirety of the film.
Yes.
I was just like nervous and anxious and yeah.
Definitely. The fear and the, one escalating set piece after another. And there are times
like, what
when
else
you
could
literally
go wrong?
Yeah. So that's my number one. Gravity.
Yeah, that's an excellent number one choice. I think we've got some good films here, but we may have a few honorable mentions for films that could have been on the list, but maybe just didn't quite make it.
I have two that are honorable mention. The first one is Elysium. It's basically a have and have not story. It's that whole, the 1%ers live orbiting the planet and they're all wealthy and rich and happy and have their own sort of story, and down below we're suffering and we're cyborgs and all of that. It just didn't make my list because Elysium kind of falls apart in the last 20 minutes. And my other one was Cloud Atlas. It's a great watch, but boy, is it trippy and confusing and hard to watch, really, because it's multiple timelines, people living through multiple iterations of their own past and future, and it's
like a love-hate thing when I see people talk about it. They either really like it or really hate it.
Very much so. Cloud Atlas is very much a yes or no.
When we did the 1950s, the 50s, an entire decade, was manageable because there was less output overall. I would say the year 2013 had as many movies as the entire decade of the 50s.
Yeah, so genre movies, not just movies.
Right, genre movies.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I had to go and watch at least some of these to get, as we said earlier, some context and to be fair, because some of them obviously I had not seen. All three of these I had not seen, but I'm going to give them honorable mentions. One is called The Harvest.
Okay.
This is directed by someone we are familiar with. His name is John McNaughton, and he directed Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer.
Ooh.
Dark movie.
Oh, man. Boy,
Well, this movie stars two great people, Samantha Morton and Michael Shannon.
Okay.
And it is basically about a couple that keep their sick son in a secluded environment. She's a nurse, and they find themselves challenged when a young girl moves in next door and starts wanting to befriend the child. And then all of a sudden, this mystery starts unfolding.
Okay.
And it is, I would say, plausibility is somewhat challenged toward the end of this movie, and that's why I didn't choose it, because I was like, oh, I don't know if that would really happen. But the performances are solid, the cast is great, and and the direction's good, so I would recommend it. Another movie is one called Jug Face.
Okay.
Jug Face is about some backwoods Tennessee people that worship a pit.
No, that would never happen.
So you've got like
My neighbor.
you've got a supernatural version of, I don't know, Deliverance. It is out there, and I was riveted from the minute I started.
Are you serious? Okay.
Yeah, I actually have considered putting it on our list too, because it's definitely better than some of the bad movies we do. So I would consider it, and the performances are strong. So anyway, it's called Jug Face, and it's a little bit of Shirley Jackson too, where someone's sacrificed to the pit,
the pit,
for the benefit of the community, that kind of thing.
That's right.
Lastly, a movie called In Fear.
Okay.
And to me, that's just a terrible title, but it stars three people. So it's a very small cast, very small story in Ireland. And one of the stars is Alan Leach, who is the guy that played Tom on Downton Abbey. I really like him. And he plays against stereotype in this, which is nice. Basically, it's about a couple driving to a music festival in Ireland, and they get lost out in rural Ireland, and someone starts terrorizing them. And I could not stop watching this film. I was really impressed with it. I wouldn't put it in my top 5, but like I said, it's in my honorable mention. It actually reminded me a lot of that movie, The Hitcher.
Ooh, loved that movie.
Yeah. And basically a lot of that was on the road with this kid being terrorized by somebody.
So those are our top 5 each. You had mentioned the movies that came out that year, and there were a lot. There were also a lot of science fiction movies that came out that year that I put on my list, and will go on record as saying are some of the worst science fiction movies ever made. I'm sure people will talk about it. And if you disagree with me, please tell me, because I know the number one people will disagree with me on, because I mentioned it on the podcast several times. But we'll go from the bottom. After Earth, M. Night Shyamalan's, it's Jaden Smith and Will Smith in this kind of post-apocalyptic, it's terrible. Under the Skin is on everybody's sci-fi list of one of the best sci-fi movies ever done, with Scarlett Johansson, directed by Jonathan Glazer. Terrible movie, awful, hate it. Riddick, I thought Pitch Black was great, but Riddick I don't like, and I didn't like the franchise, and this movie's terrible. The Host, it is a YA series of novels that were written by Stephanie Meyer, the same one that wrote Twilight. Instead of vampires, now it's aliens, and they are parasites that take over humans. So
but I'm in love with one.
Oh yeah. There's definitely a love story in it. So only 3 more. So my 3 more worst of this year: Pacific Rim, Guillermo del Toro, of course; Snowpiercer, and I loathe that movie. I don't like it. I don't think it's good. I don't buy the train perpetually being the class system of the world going around the planet forever. Bad movie. Don't like it. Challenge me. Let me know how I'm wrong.
It's a metaphor, David.
Yeah, it didn't work. It's a bad metaphor. It doesn't work. And Star Trek Into Dankness. It is the sequel to J.J. Abrams' reboot of Star Trek. It is their version of The Wrath of Khan, and it is terrible.
It's awful. I know.
It is shows a total lack of understanding of what Star Trek is. Plot holes everywhere, bad plotting, bad story. bad characterizations, and just not Star Trek.
And for anyone out there that would like to hear us talk about Star Trek, we have a
Yes.
Patreon channel. We're not
We
going to
do.
go into it here because
We
that
do.
could get lengthy.
But that's good Star Trek. So
All
you
right.
had some other context films?
I
too?
do. I'm going to list these kind of fast because I have a bunch. And I did what I did last time and I categorized them. First, big budget. And this is going to be one, like you said, that's going to piss some people off. But I hate this movie. It's called World War Z.
Yeah.
It stars Brad Pitt. Two big problems with this movie. One is that they totally ignored Max Brooks's book and did their own screenplay. It had barely even resembles Max Brooks's book. And two, it's a political action movie that wants to be a horror movie. And it is not. I'll just put it this way. You know how much I love zombie movies. It doesn't matter if they're fast or slow. You know I'm somewhat of an authority on it, and I've even written a book.
You are.
This is not a good movie. We'll just leave it at that. Another fairly big budget movie was called The Green Inferno. This was Eli Roth's homage to a movie called Cannibal Holocaust that came out in 1980. It's okay, but it doesn't make even my honorable mentions. I wouldn't consider it for the podcast. It's basically a kind of an exploitation film, but done in a modern way. And then lastly, another big budget movie that year, or at least moderate budget, was The Purge, a movie with Ethan Hawke. And I did watch this movie recently. I've watched all three of these, but I watched this one recently, and I didn't hate it. It's a small movie, in a small setting, but I don't know why it went on to spawn so many sequels, and the premise of it seems really preposterous to me. So it's kind of hard for me to bite into that. Found footage movies. There's a movie called Willow Creek, directed by Bobcat Goldthwait. It is a Bigfoot movie. It is as boring as the Blair Witch Project. There's an entire 17-minute scene with two people sitting in a tent being terrorized by noise. Not good. Another movie I watched that was good, and it is a found footage, is called The Borderlands. Actually, in America, it's known as Final Prayer, but in Britain, where it was made, it's called The Borderlands. And it's about the catacombs beneath an old church in England. I'll just leave it at that. It's pretty good, but that's just for context. I also watched Devil's Pass, which is Rennie Harlin's take on people up in snow country on a mountain. Not good at all. And there's one called The Den, which I have not seen and couldn't bring myself to watch another found footage. Folk horror. There's a movie called A Field in England that I did watch, and the costumes were great, but basically it was in black and white and just guys in a field talking. So that kind of gets a little boring. For body horror, I watched a movie called Contracted. This is about a woman who thinks she contracted an STD when she was microdosed or whatever at a party and raped, and it turns out what she got is far worse than an STD. This movie wasn't too bad. It is definitely body horror though, so prepare to be grossed out. Comedy horror, I didn't even bother watching these because I'm not big on comedy in my horror, but there was a movie called Horns, based on the Joe Hill book. That's Stephen King's son. One called Only Lovers Left Alive, which is the Jim Jarmusch vampire thing with Tilda Swinton. I have not seen it. And Warm Bodies, which is a zombie comedy. Sci-fi hybrids, you mentioned Under the Skin. There's also a movie called Dark Skies. And then sequels. Insidious Chapter 2, I Spit on Your Grave 2, The Last Exorcism Part 2, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D, Wolf Creek 2, Curse of Chucky, Fright Night 2, New Blood, Hatchet 3, VHS 2, A Haunting in Connecticut 2, and The Toolbox Murderers 2, along with a plethora of crap I have never heard of. So at least those I had heard of. But I would say you could double what I just did as far as output in 2013.
Well, I mean, I think it's good that there's opportunity out there for filmmakers. I think it's good that there's a plethora of good, bad mixed in different hybrids, whatever. That says a lot because we go into these cycles sometimes where we struggle even trying to find a good quote horror movie from that year or science fiction movie from that year. It's good that we have a variety.
Yeah, I totally agree. I liked your top 5. I like my top 5, but we want to know what you folks out there think. Yes. Obviously, some of you are going to disagree with us. That's okay. You can let us know in the comments. While you're down there, please subscribe because we would like to grow this little thing that we're creating here as far as top 5s of various years. If you like what you see, please tell somebody about it. Also, we have other shows you can check out as well. We do a Coming to Get You show, which is basically a coming attraction show. Our regular show, Johnny Has the Keys, we pick one movie once a week over the last 100 years, either sci-fi or horror, and dive into it deeply. And then we also, as I mentioned, have a Patreon channel where if you're interested in either Star Trek or the X-Files, we have shows there as well as some bonus content. And until next time, David, when I guess we will probably go further back in history since we're so current right now.
And let us know if you're watching this, put a comment down there. What year should we do or what decade should we do? Pick a year or a decade, challenge us, and we'll see what we can come up with for you.
We look forward to it. And I'll see you then.
All right.
Start the car. Johnny has the keys.